I can still see that moment clear as day. I was standing alone in my kitchen in Maple Ridge, North Carolina, staring down at a plain white envelope, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped it. Inside was a single page that changed everything. No greeting, no explanation, just a blunt ultimatum from the HOA, 7 days to pay in full or foreclosure proceedings would begin. That was it. 7 days before they could legally start taking my home. This was not about missed dues from years ago or some old mistake. This was a sudden, so-called emergency assessment they claimed I owed immediately, thousands of dollars. Money I simply did not have. I had a wife, 2 kids, and a mortgage that already stretched us thin. Losing this house meant ripping the ground out from under my entire family. What cut the deepest was the tone. Cold, confident, almost smug. Like the HOA board already knew I would panic, beg, or somehow scrape the money together. They thought I would fold quietly. What they did not realize was that those 7 days were not the end of my story. They were the beginning of theirs. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? When I first moved into Maple Ridge Estates, it felt like I had finally made it. That was almost a decade earlier, back when the HOA barely registered as something to worry about. The dues were reasonable, the rules made sense, and the board mostly stayed out of people's lives. Neighbors waved at each other. Kids rode bikes in the evenings. Cookouts happened without anyone worrying about whether a grill was 2 inches too close to a fence. It felt like a real community, not a checklist. Back then, HOA meetings were optional and boring. A handful of people would show up, talk about landscaping, approve the budget, and leave. Nobody was power hungry. Nobody seemed interested in controlling anyone else. That calm lasted until Linda Haversham showed up. Linda did not start as president. At first, she was just another homeowner who complained loudly at meetings. She always sat in the front row, arms crossed, correcting people mid-sentence. Within a year, she had maneuvered herself onto the board. Another year after that, she was president. That was when everything changed. Almost overnight, new rules started appearing. Rules nobody remembered voting on. Rules buried deep in emails sent during work hours. Grass height limits became stricter. Trash cans had to be pulled in by a specific hour, or fines would appear. Paint colors that had been approved for years were suddenly non-compliant. Appeals went nowhere. People would submit them and never hear back. When they followed up, they were told the appeal had been denied or never received. Board meetings stopped feeling like discussions and started feeling like theater. Linda would open the meeting with a smile that never reached her eyes. Items were rushed through. Homeowners who tried to speak were interrupted or told they were off topic. Votes happened fast, always in Linda's favor. It felt like decisions were made somewhere else, long before anyone ever sat down in those folding chairs. Still, most of us kept our heads down. We paid our dues. We fixed what they told us to fix. We grumbled quietly but assumed it would blow over eventually. That was the mistake. The so-called emergency assessment showed up after a heavy storm rolled through Maple Ridge. The storm knocked down tree branches, flooded a few yards, and cracked the old community entrance sign. The sign was nothing fancy, just brick and wood with the neighborhood name. It had looked the same since the development was built. Nobody loved it, but nobody hated it either. A week later, the email went out. The HOA claimed the sign needed immediate replacement with a premium design to maintain property values. There were no pictures, no contractor names, no explanation of why it could not be repaired, just a number and a deadline. Every homeowner owed their share, payable in full within 7 days. I read the email 3 times, thinking I had missed something. There was no mention of a vote, no mention of reserves, no option for a payment plan, just pay or face consequences. I started asking questions. I emailed the board politely, asking for documentation. I asked to see bids from contractors. I asked why the reserve fund was not being used for what was clearly a shared expense. I asked why we were being rushed when the sign was not a safety issue. The response came back the next day. One sentence, cold and final. Failure to pay will result in lien placement and foreclosure. That was it. No answers, no explanation, just a threat. I remember sitting at my desk staring at that email, my stomach sinking. Fear hit first, real, heavy fear. I imagined a lien on my home. I imagined court papers. I imagined trying to explain to my kids why we might have to move. For a few minutes, I actually considered draining our savings just to make it go away. Then something shifted. The more I reread that sentence, the more wrong it felt. Not just harsh, but deliberate, like they wanted people scared. Like the threat itself was the point. I realized this was not about a sign. It was about control. That fear slowly burned into anger. Quiet at first, then steady, because I knew we were being bullied. And bullies only win when everyone stays silent. That was the moment I stopped being just another homeowner trying to keep the peace. That was the moment I decided I was not going to let the HOA scare me out of my own home without a fight. I tried to handle it the way you were supposed to. Calm. Respectful. By the book. I went to the next HOA meeting with my notes printed out and my questions lined up, telling myself that once everything was out in the open, this would get resolved. I really believed that. The meeting was held in the small clubhouse near the pool, the same room where meetings used to be quick and uneventful. This time, the air felt heavier. Linda sat at the front table, perfectly composed, hands folded, wearing that tight smile she always used when she thought she was in control. When it was my turn to speak, I explained that I had received the emergency assessment notice and that I was confused. I asked where the homeowner vote had taken place. I asked how the amount was calculated. I asked why the reserve fund was not being used. Linda did not miss a beat. She smiled and said the rules were very clear and that the board had the authority to act quickly in emergencies. When I asked her to point out where that authority was written, she deflected. When I asked again about the vote, she said the board had handled it internally. When I asked to see the financial records related to the assessment, she leaned back in her chair and said they were not required to be shared immediately. Immediately. That word stuck with me. Every answer felt rehearsed. Every question was brushed aside. Other board members stared at their papers or nodded along without saying much. The meeting moved on as if nothing had happened, like my home was not hanging in the balance. After the meeting, neighbors approached me quietly in the parking lot. They spoke in low voices, looking around like someone might be listening. One couple admitted they had already paid because they were terrified of a lien. Another neighbor said he was borrowing money from family just to avoid trouble. A single mother down the street told me she cried all night after getting the notice and did not know what to do. That was when I realized exactly what the HOA was doing. They were using fear as a weapon, panic as leverage. The shorter the deadline, the less time people had to think, to question, or to push back. It was not just unfair. It was strategic. I contacted the property management company the next morning, hoping maybe someone there would be more reasonable. I explained the situation and asked for clarification. The woman on the phone sounded sympathetic at first, but every answer ended the same way. You will need to speak with the board. When I asked who authorized the assessment, she said the board. When I asked about the foreclosure threat, she said that decision also came from the board. Every path I tried to take looped right back to Linda and the same group of people. Meanwhile, the clock kept ticking. Each day felt heavier than the last. I checked my email constantly, half expecting another threat to show up. I replayed the meeting in my head, wondering if I had said the wrong thing or missed an opening. By day 4, I was barely sleeping. I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about worst-case scenarios. court notices, moving trucks, explaining everything to my kids. One night, my wife finally asked the question neither of us wanted to say out loud. She asked what we would do if we lost the house. I did not have an answer. And that scared me more than the letter ever had. That question broke something open inside me. Up until then, I had still been hoping the HOA would come to its senses, that someone would step in and fix it. But sitting there in the dark, listening to my wife's voice shake, I realized something important. The HOA was not going to stop. Not unless someone forced them to. I went back to the notice and read it again. Slowly, line by line. I noticed how carefully it was worded, how confident it sounded, how it assumed compliance. That was when another thought crept in. What if they were counting on people not knowing their rights? What if the threat itself was the whole game? I stopped thinking like a scared homeowner and started thinking like someone who needed answers, real answers. I pulled up the thick folder of HOA documents we were given when we bought the house and had not touched in years. I started reading. Bylaws, covenants, rules I had never paid attention to before. For the first time since that letter arrived, I felt something other than fear. I felt focus. I realized that asking nicely was not going to work. They had already shown me who they were and how far they were willing to go. If I wanted to protect my family and my home, I needed more than questions. I needed leverage, and I was determined to find it. That night, after everyone else in the house had gone to bed, I sat at the dining room table with a laptop, a legal pad, and a growing sense that something was not adding up. If the HOA was so confident, so aggressive, then everything they were doing had to be airtight. At least, that was what they wanted us to believe. I decided to stop guessing and start verifying. I began with the county records, deeds, filings, financial disclosures. It was slow, boring work at first, the kind of thing that makes your eyes blur after a while. But then I stumbled across the HOA's governing documents, the actual recorded versions, not the shortened summaries Linda liked to reference at meetings. I printed them out and started reading carefully, highlighting anything that mentioned assessments. That was when I found it. Buried in the language, clear as day, was a requirement that any special or emergency assessment over a specific amount had to be approved by a vote of the homeowners, not a board decision, not an internal discussion, a vote. There had been no vote, no balance, no meeting notice, nothing. My heart started pounding, but I kept reading. I did not want to get ahead of myself. Then I found the section on reserves. According to the documents, the HOA was required to maintain reserve funds specifically for repairs and replacements of common property. Entrance signage was listed as an example. In other words, the exact situation they claimed justified the emergency assessment. What they had done was not just aggressive. It was illegal. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, trying to process it. The fear that had been sitting in my chest for days finally loosened its grip, replaced by something sharper and more dangerous to the HOA clarity. But the night was not done with surprises. As I dug deeper, cross-referencing bank disclosures and older meeting notes posted online years earlier, I found something even better. Several years before Linda became president, the HOA had taken out a sizable loan for landscaping improvements. The loan was still active. The payments were ongoing, yet it had never been disclosed to homeowners in any recent financial summary. That explained everything. The reserve account was not empty. It had been drained to service that loan. Instead of admitting mismanagement, the board had shifted the burden onto homeowners under the guise of an emergency. And they had done it fast, hoping no one would look too closely. I printed everything. Screenshots, PDFs, notes. By the time I finished, the sun was starting to rise. I was exhausted, but for the first time since this started, I was not scared. I had proof. The next step was to do things the right way again, but this time with the law on my side. I submitted a formal records request under state law, citing the specific statutes that required HOAs to provide financial documents upon request. I asked for meeting minutes, bank statements, loan documents, and any communication related to the assessment. Days passed. No response. I followed up with certified letters sent directly to the HOA and the property management company. I kept copies of everything. Receipts, tracking numbers, deadlines. Still nothing. The silence told me everything I needed to know. That was when I contacted a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. I walked into his office with a thick folder and a simple question: can they really do this? He took his time going through the documents, nodding slowly as he read. When he finally looked up, his expression said it all. They cannot, he told me, and the way they are threatening foreclosure makes this much worse for them. He explained that the board had overstepped its authority on multiple fronts: illegal assessment, failure to disclose financial obligations, improper use of reserve funds, and worst of all, using foreclosure threats to coerce payment without legal standing. We drafted a formal response that same afternoon. It laid out every violation clearly and calmly. No emotion, just facts, statutes, and consequences. It demanded immediate suspension of the assessment and full disclosure of financial records. The email went out that evening. The response came the next morning. For the first time since this ordeal began, Linda's tone had changed. Gone was the smug confidence. Gone were the one-line threats. Her email was longer, careful. She said the board was reviewing the matter and asked for time. She sounded nervous. And that was how I knew the balance of power had shifted. Once I had legal backing, everything moved fast. My attorney helped me draft a formal demand letter, and this time there was no room for vague language or intimidation. The letter laid out every violation in clear, undeniable terms. The assessment was improper. There had been no homeowner vote. Financial information had been withheld. Reserve funds had been misused. And most damning of all, the board had threatened foreclosure without legal authority. The letter demanded immediate suspension of the assessment, full financial disclosure, and written confirmation that no liens or foreclosure actions would be pursued against any homeowner. It also made one thing very clear: if the board failed to comply, legal action would follow. We sent it certified and by email, addressed to every board member and the property management company. I remember clicking send and feeling my heart race, not from fear this time, but from resolve. For days, I had been reacting. Now, I was acting. But the real shift did not happen with that letter. It happened when I stopped keeping everything to myself. I printed copies of the documents I had found, the governing rules, the reserve requirements, the undisclosed loan, and the state statutes the HOA had violated. Then I started talking to my neighbors, not in whispers this time. Open conversations, driveway talks, messages in the neighborhood group chat. I explained exactly what was happening and showed them proof. The reaction was immediate. Homeowners who had already paid were furious. One neighbor stormed over to my house holding his receipt, asking how the board could demand money illegally. Others admitted they had paid out of fear, worried they would lose their homes if they did not comply. Now they wanted refunds. People who had not paid yet refused outright. The panic that had worked so well for the HOA evaporated almost overnight. The board tried to regain control. Emails went out claiming the assessment was fully authorized and necessary for community standards. Linda framed it as a misunderstanding, insisting the board had acted in everyone's best interest. But this time, her words were no match for actual documents. Every claim she made could be countered with a paragraph from the bylaws or a line from state law. The next HOA meeting was nothing like the ones before. The clubhouse was packed. People stood along the walls and spilled into the hallway. Neighbors who had never attended a meeting in their lives were suddenly there, holding papers, asking questions, demanding answers. Linda opened the meeting and tried to stick to the agenda, but she lost control almost immediately. Hands shot up. Voices overlapped. Homeowners asked where the vote had been. They asked why a loan had been hidden. They asked who authorized foreclosure threats. Linda attempted to deflect, but the room would not let her. Every time she tried to move on, someone stopped her. That was when my attorney stood up. He introduced himself calmly and explained that he represented multiple homeowners, not just me. Then he walked through the violations one by one, using the HOA's own documents as evidence. The room went silent as he explained that board members could be held personally liable for actions taken outside their authority, not the HOA, not the insurance, them. You could see the color drain from Linda's face. He made it clear that threatening foreclosure without legal grounds exposed the board to serious consequences. Lawsuits, financial penalties, removal from office. The word personal landed hard. This was no longer an abstract dispute. This was about their own money, their own reputations, and their own futures. The meeting dissolved into chaos after that. Motions were shouted. Demands were made. Linda tried to adjourn, but the homeowners refused to leave. For the first time, the board was on the defensive, scrambling to answer questions they had never expected to face. Walking out of that meeting, I knew something had changed for good. The HOA had built its power on silence and fear. Now that the truth was out, that power was gone. And the board knew it. The days after that meeting felt like standing in the calm before a storm. Emails flew back and forth. The HOA suddenly became very talkative, sending long messages full of carefully chosen words and vague reassurances. They announced a special meeting to address concerns, and this time they made sure to note that their attorney would be present. That alone told me everything I needed to know. When the night of the meeting arrived, the atmosphere was electric. The clubhouse was even more crowded than before. People brought spouses, neighbors, even friends who were curious about what was happening. Folding chairs filled every inch of the room, and homeowners lined the walls again. You could feel the tension buzzing, like everyone knew this was coming to a head. Linda sat at the front with the rest of the board, her posture stiff. Next to her was the HOA's lawyer, a man in an expensive suit with a legal pad balanced on his knee. My attorney sat a few rows back with me, calm and unbothered. The contrast could not have been clearer. Linda called the meeting to order and launched into a prepared statement about unity and community standards. She barely made it 2 minutes before the questions started. Homeowners challenged motions. Others demanded explanations. Voices rose as people spoke over one another, refusing to be brushed aside again. When Linda tried to stick to the agenda, someone called out that the assessment was not on it. When she tried to move forward anyway, another homeowner stood and demanded a vote to suspend the assessment immediately. The room erupted in agreement. That was when the lawyers stepped in. The HOA's attorney spoke first, attempting to calm the room. He framed the assessment as a necessary response to unforeseen damage and urged homeowners to trust the board. But every time he spoke, someone countered with a document or a direct quote from the bylaws. His confidence began to waver. Then my attorney stood up. He spoke clearly and deliberately, making sure everyone could hear him. He explained that threatening foreclosure without proper authority was not just a mistake, but a serious legal violation. He outlined how each board member could be named individually in lawsuits for acting outside the scope of their duties. Not hypothetically, in reality. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He explained that multiple homeowners had standing to sue, not just one. That the board's insurance might not cover intentional misconduct. That continuing to enforce the assessment would only make the situation worse. The room was silent. Linda tried to interrupt, but my attorney continued. He explained that if the board wanted to limit damage, the smartest move was to suspend the assessment immediately, disclose all financial records, and halt any foreclosure or lien actions already in motion. That was when Linda tried to adjourn the meeting. She said the discussion had gotten out of hand and that the board would address concerns at a later time. She started to gather her papers, but the homeowners would not let her. People stood up. Someone shouted that she could not just walk away. Another homeowner formally challenged the adjournment, citing meeting rules that Linda herself had enforced countless times. For once, the rules worked against her. A motion was made to suspend the assessment. Another homeowner seconded it. Linda looked to her lawyer, clearly panicked. He leaned in and whispered something to her that made her jaw tighten. The vote was called. Every hand in the room went up, unanimous. The assessment was officially suspended. No liens, no foreclosure threats, no payment deadlines. Just like that, the weapon the HOA had used against us disappeared. Linda stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the floor. She did not say a word. She grabbed her bag and stormed out of the room, heels clicking sharply down the hallway. The door slammed behind her. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the room erupted, not in anger, but in relief. People hugged. Some laughed. Others wiped tears from their eyes. I sat there, stunned, realizing that just days earlier, I had been counting down the hours to losing my home. That night, the board finally understood something they had forgotten. They were not in charge of the community. The homeowners were. Once the assessment was suspended, everything unraveled faster than I ever expected. What started as a dispute over a sign turned into a full-blown reckoning for the HOA. Homeowners demanded answers, and this time there was no way for the board to hide behind vague emails or rush meetings. Too many eyes were watching. Within weeks, an independent audit was ordered, not one arranged by the board, but one insisted on by homeowners and backed by legal pressure. The auditors requested bank statements, invoices, contracts, and internal communications going back several years. Boxes of records were hauled into a rented office space. The board had no choice but to comply. The results were devastating. The audit revealed that funds had been routinely misused. Reserve money meant for long-term repairs had been quietly redirected to cover the landscaping loan and other expenses that were never properly approved. Several transactions were poorly documented. Others made no sense at all. Meeting minutes had been altered after the fact to make it appear as though approvals had been given when they had not. Conflicts of interest surfaced as well, including vendors connected to people close to the board. As the findings became known, the mood in the neighborhood shifted from anger to disbelief. People could not wrap their heads around how much had been hidden in plain sight. What hurt the most was realizing how long it had gone on simply because no one had questioned it. Linda tried to hold on at first. She issued a carefully worded statement claiming the issues were administrative errors and blaming past boards. But the evidence was overwhelming. Homeowners were no longer interested in excuses. Before a formal vote to remove her could even be scheduled, Linda resigned. No farewell message, no apology. Just a brief notice sent through the management company stating she was stepping down, effective immediately. After everything she had put people through, the silence felt fitting. Her control ended not with a dramatic speech, but with a quiet exit. The fallout did not stop there. Once the scope of the problems became clear, the HOA insurance carrier stepped in. They reviewed the audit and the legal exposure and made a decision quickly. To limit further liability, they required immediate corrective actions. All fines related to the improper assessment were refunded. Any payment already made was returned to homeowners in full. New policies were mandated, including strict financial transparency, regular audits, and mandatory training for future board members. Most importantly to me, the foreclosure notice against my home was voided permanently. Not suspended, not delayed. Gone. The lien threat was officially withdrawn in writing, with confirmation that no foreclosure action had ever been legally valid. I held that letter in my hands for a long time. It felt unreal. Just weeks earlier, I had been counting down 7 days, wondering how I would explain everything to my family. Now, the threat that had consumed my life was nothing more than a piece of paper with no power behind it. The board that once acted untouchable was now scrambling to protect itself. Members sought legal advice. Some resigned quietly, others avoided eye contact at the mailbox. The authority they once wielded so confidently had evaporated under the weight of their own actions. What struck me the most was how quickly the balance shifted. The HOA had relied on intimidation and silence. The moment those tools were taken away, everything collapsed. Their own tactics had backfired in spectacular fashion. The same board that gave me 7 days to lose my home was now fighting to save its reputation, its finances, and in some cases, itself. And for the first time since this all began, I finally felt like I could breathe again. After the chaos settled, Maple Ridge began to feel like a neighborhood again instead of a pressure cooker. The constant tension that had hung over everything slowly faded. Emails from the HOA stopped sounding like threats and started sounding like information. For the first time in a long while, people stopped bracing themselves every time a message came through. A new board election was scheduled, and this time, people paid attention. Homeowners who had never considered getting involved before suddenly stepped forward. The meetings were packed, but not with anger. With purpose, questions were asked. Candidates were challenged. Promises of transparency were demanded, not assumed. When the new board was finally elected, it felt like a reset button had been pressed. One of their first actions was to adopt strict transparency rules. Financial reports would be shared regularly. Reserve accounts would be clearly documented. Major expenses would require homeowner approval, just as the governing documents had always required. Audits were no longer something to fear, but something expected. The days of rushed decisions and hidden records were officially over. The change rippled through the neighborhood in ways I did not expect. Neighbors started talking again, really talking. People lingered outside instead of rushing indoors. Conversations that once happened in whispers now happened openly on sidewalks and driveways. There was a shared sense of relief, like everyone had been holding their breath and could finally exhale. At home, the difference was immediate. The fear that had settled into our daily lives lifted. My wife stopped jumping every time the mail arrived. My kids went back to worrying about school and friends instead of overhearing tense conversations at night. The house felt like a home again, not a temporary place we might lose at any moment. We stayed. Not just physically, but emotionally. For a while, we had lived like we were on borrowed time. Now we could plan again: holidays, repairs, the future. What stayed with me most was how much power the HOA had only because we gave it to them without realizing it. For years, people assumed the board knew what it was doing. They assumed the rules were always enforced fairly. They assumed pushing back would only make things worse. The assessment shattered that illusion. Once people questioned the board, everything changed. Once someone asked to see the documents, the intimidation fell apart. The HOA did not lose power because of one lawsuit or one meeting. It lost power because people stopped being afraid. I also learned something about myself through all of this. I had never seen myself as a fighter. I just wanted a quiet life, a stable home, and a place to raise my family. But when that was threatened, something else kicked in. Not anger for the sake of anger, but determination. The kind that comes from knowing what you stand to lose. Maple Ridge did not become perfect overnight. Disagreements still happen. Rules still exist. But there is a difference now. Decisions are discussed. Records are available. And the board understands that it answers to the homeowners, not the other way around. Fear no longer runs this community. Knowledge does. Accountability does. And every time I drive past that entrance sign, still standing, repaired instead of replaced, I am reminded that standing up does not just protect your own home. Sometimes it changes an entire neighborhood. Looking back now, it is hard to believe how much power 7 days held over my life. Not because I paid, not because I panicked, but because I refused to be bullied into silence. The HOA expected fear. They expected quick compliance. They expected no one to look too closely. What they got instead was accountability, and that made all the difference. This experience taught me something I will never forget. Know your documents. Read them. Keep them. Understand them. The rules that govern your community are not just there to control homeowners, they are also there to limit the board. And when a board forgets that, it is on us to remind them. Never assume they are untouchable just because they act confident or sound official. Our home is more than walls and a roof. It is where our kids feel safe. It is where memories are made. It is stability in a world that already feels uncertain enough. No one should be allowed to threaten that through intimidation, shortcuts, or abuse of power without facing consequences. What started as the worst letter of my life ended up changing our entire neighborhood for the better. Fear lost its grip. Transparency took its place. And a community that had been quiet for too long finally found its voice. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?